So for the ancient Greeks, death was a very public affair. Diana Burton is one of many scholars to make this observation. As we know, our museums are full of objects which signify death, and yet a topic decidedly missing from the ancient artistic canon is that of life, of pregnancy, and of parturition. There are practically no examples of these crucial stages of a woman's life found in ancient Greek art. However, for the span of about a century, from the 5th to the 4th centuries BCE, death and motherhood are entwined on a small group of funerary monuments, which have so far garnered little to no attention from scholars. It's these funerary monuments that I'll focus on today. Now, during this talk, I really hope to show you how the material evidence of grey stelae and marble lekythoi can be used to contextualize depictions of motherhood and childbirth, and to highlight societal influence on pregnancy and the role of the Athenian woman within the polis. Within the next 40 or so minutes, I hope to explain the role of the funerary monument in fashioning the ideal citizen through the contextualization of gender dynamics and societal movement in classical Athens. What I hope to do is to reconstruct the image created by these monuments and their reaction, if any reaction can even be reconstructed thoroughly, that they would have encouraged from their audience, especially from other women. Now, multiple studies have focused on the experiences of childhood and motherhood in antiquity. However, none have really fully discussed the role of funerary stelae, and most are more than a decade old at this point. The two volumes on the screen are especially useful for the overall context of this research. So that's Nancy Demann's Birth, Death, and Motherhood in Classical Greece, and Lauren Hackworth-Peterson and Patricia Salzman-Mitchell's Mothering and Motherhood in Ancient Greece and Rome. If you're interested in looking into this topic in more depth, I would definitely suggest reading these two volumes. What I hope to do is I hope to expand on these studies and offer a new reading of how this small group of funerary monuments can help us reconstruct the status of certain 5th century Athenian women and the gravity with which death, and especially death in childbirth, would have been experienced by the entire community. Now, parturition and childbirth, it holds an immense importance for the continuation of a society, and yet Greek art rarely shows any scenes of pregnancy or childbirth. Despite the scholarly investigations as to why this is the case, why there is such a lack of these scenes in art, there's been no definitive answer proposed which would explain the prevalent gap in the visual record. A few potential examples of classical and Hellenistic figurines depicting pregnancy have been found, but the lack of context makes their authenticity really suspect. So Murray Lee is a scholar who has argued that this terracotta figurine, which is headless on the left of your screens, it's found in the Louvre, and she argues that it's a votive of a pregnant woman. But I instead state that it's most likely a grotesque figurine such as this one on the right. Now, of course, there are slight differences between the two figurines, but they both fit the usual type of depicting miniature grotesques. And since there's no precedence of depicting pregnant women, especially pregnant figurines in Greek art, it's most likely that the figure on the right is a grotesque figurine of comedy. Now, the relative rarity of depictions of pregnancy has led to the identification of certain objects on the art market as forgeries. Sir Henry Wellcome's museum collection in London houses this alleged marble figurine of a pregnant woman credited as Roman. However, this is most probably a forgery, if it can even be said to be depicting a pregnant woman at all. There's no information on their website as to the provenance of this object, and the placement of the fabric of the dress diagonally across the belly is not usual in this period, which makes me suspect that it might actually be a forgery. Now, a few potential examples of pregnancy have been found in ancient art in general, outside of the Greek world. I put a few up on the screen here. On the left-hand side, we have what is called the Venus of Willendorf, or just a Venus figurine in general. It's a famous Paleolithic figurine said to be depicting a woman. However, there's much scholarly debate as to whether it's actually meant to depict a pregnant woman or denote a fertility goddess of some kind. Right next to it, we have a Roman funerary relief from Ostia, which very clearly shows a scene of childbirth. But what's important here to note is that the focus of this stele is on the midwife and not on the mother giving birth. This is similar to when we see Roman stelae which depict the deceased profession, so similar to a relief of a baker or a banker, which means that here the focus is on the midwife and her job in her life instead of the act of parturition itself. Furthermore, on the top right-hand side, you see this relief from the Dendera temple complex in Egypt, but what's important here is that it's a depiction of a goddess giving birth and not a human, normal woman. And below it, we have this rattle from Alexandria, which could potentially depict a woman giving birth, but there have also been other suggestions as to what it could depict. Now, the presence of these examples at all in the visual record at least tells us that pregnancy and parturition are represented to some extent in cultures outside of Greece. Therefore, what that means for us is that the Athenian rules for pregnancy and parturition must not be universal and are specifically particular to 5th century Athens. Now, there are varying theories which might explain the lack of such a prominent life stage from Greek. Certain male scholars in the past centuries have even argued for an apathy of the ancient people towards pregnancy, considering the high mortality rates of infants. That's to say that certain scholars have stated that perhaps because parents would have been expecting potential death during pregnancy or the death of infants in the first 5 years of life, that they simply would not have cared as much as to depict it on art. Now, others have also posed the theory of it being bad luck to depict the mother or for her to be seen whilst being pregnant. And this is similar to the idea of the evil eye of certain contemporary cultures. I instead actually argue that the strong purity regulations of the 5th and 4th centuries are responsible for the lack of pregnancy and parturition within the iconographic language of contemporary Greek art, specifically because of connotations of pollution and the ignorance of men as to what the event of childbirth actually looked like. And this is important to note because men in this period are the main commissioners and makers of art. And when we think about these purity laws, we have to think about those that attribute religious miasma and pollution to childbirth and pregnancy, something that we can even see in certain cultures today. We have a dossier of purity regulations from Cyrene from around 325 to 300 BCE. And it records that a woman in childbirth will, quote, pollute the house, end quote, and whoever else is in it. Similarly, a pregnant woman must go to the Nymphaeon, which is the Greek temple, before she gives birth and purify herself along with leaving a sacrifice. But if a woman miscarries, she will be just as polluted in death as if she were to have died. Furthermore, women were seen as polluted after giving birth, to the point where they were not allowed to be present at their children's naming ceremonies 10 days after birth. Although this epigraphic evidence comes later in the timeline and outside of mainland Greece, it could denote a general consensus as to the miasma associated with childbirth within the wider Greek society. In fact, there are many societies worldwide today in which childbirth and menstrual blood are seen as impure or polluting. Now, considering this general context, it's peculiar to find a rather limited subset of grave stelae and marble lekythoi which allude to the act of parturition, especially considering the quite isolated nature of the lives of Athenian women. The masculine-dominated archive of biased text and male-commissioned artworks creates a limitation for the study of female life. And in the cultural context of the polis, in which men could occupy both an external and internal role, so as a citizen, instead confined to the sphere of the oikos, the household, and the oikos framed the entirety of their life, acting as a backdrop for all major phases from their upbringing to the later adulthood in their husband's oikos. This isolation of women during life, however, we can see it greatly contrasts their public display in death, especially in the Kerameikos, which is the public cemetery of Athens. It raises this question of whether death was the only acceptable time for a woman to be seen in public. Now, grave stelae, we finally get to them. They, as forms of burial markers, they come about in the Archaic period in Attica, and they survive multiple bans and restrictions throughout the 4th century BC. The surviving corpus that I'm working with is assembled by Christophe Clermont in 1993 and shows a significant presence of women within the archaeological evidence. So interestingly enough, the catalogue compiles 628 tombstones featuring female figures, as opposed to 468 tombstones of men and more than 1,000 featuring both. An analysis of these grave stelae depicting both genders emphasizes the masculine connection to the polis and to the community, whereas a female emphasis on the household. So we have 3 examples on the screen here. On the left-hand side, you see the stelae of Dixileos and the stelae of Timnias, and they show an emphasis of the deceased men that their connection was to the polis and to the community. Whereas the stele of Hegesso, which you see on the right-hand side, is arguably the most famous classical stele out there. It depicts a feminine emphasis on the household. So whilst Dixileos is depicted in his duty as a warrior, Timnias as a councilman, as you can see by his staff, Hegesso is actually looking at her jewelry box with an attendant standing in front of her, showing her role within the household, very much sheltered from the outside world and the outside community. Now, from this data, we can see what Robin Osborne sort of states, that although women were unacceptable as objects of representation on Athenian archaic grave monuments, they are suddenly much more acceptable on Athenian classical grave monuments and vases. But this leads us to the question of what events actually led to this exact increase in the depiction of women in art. How do we go from a lack of women in art to a burst of activity within the classical period? That would be the Periclean laws of the 450s BCE. So a quick refresher on the Periclean laws. They are a set of legislation brought about by an Athenian statesman called Pericles, which state that the citizenship of Athens is granted only to those men who have both an Athenian father and an Athenian mother. Unlike before, now the status of the mother and her familial history become much more important, since for an Athenian man, citizenship and access to the council was the most important aspect of their livelihood. Robin Osborne and Karen Steers are 2 scholars that both argue that the implementation of Pericles' citizenship law created a political shift in which women were now more important in representing family. This being so, the representation of one's mother, wife, or daughter takes on new stakes for the identity of men themselves and brings the focus of art onto the maternal body. However, this individualism is always in tension with the generic typology of grave stelae. If we look at a group of grave stelae, we'll often denote that they look quite similar. Instead, epitaphs provide the personalizing element to counteract the use of stencils and models within the artistic workshops. If before, the role of women in art was confined to mythological scenes and depictions of the household and vases, now the identity of individual women holds weight in the representation and legitimization of the entire family. We come across the term female citizen in this period. So Raphael Seeley argues that women were citizens only to the extent that they could produce citizen offspring, but that female citizenship was at best functional or subservient. And Christopher Joyce builds on previous studies, including this one, to discuss the importance of differentiating between categories of citizenship and societal participation. So female citizenship is in no way equal to male citizenship during this period. It's in fact authorized and legitimized through channels of cultural and political power typically controlled by men. However, what this period shows us is that women's identities are now more important within the political sphere. Robin Osborne also notes that the changing appearance of the cemetery may have begun by the changing of the representations of women. So it also became a means of changing attitudes towards women within the society itself. Within the increased depictions of women in art, the private sphere slowly blurs with the public one. So, if men can freely travel between spheres, being both a statesman but also a head of the household, a husband, and a warrior, women are stuck in this liminal space. They're expected to lead a very private life, but at the same time, they're exploited publicly for the male gaze. Now it's here that I have compiled a body of evidence figuring about 70 examples of grave stelae and marble lekythoi, which depict women who have died in childbirth. From these examples, I've created a typology based on the differences in iconographical language. This study, to my knowledge, is unique in its reconstruction of a historical and morphological typology of grave stelae depicting maternal parturition. So of this corpus, 43, so that's 32 stelae and 11 lekythoi, depict the deceased woman seated while an attendant stands in front of her holding an infant. These form type A, or what I call the Filonoi type. A further 17 examples, so that's 13 stelae and 4 lekythoi, form type B, or the Archesis type, and they depict a seated mother holding the infant herself. Type C, or the Theophante type, only holds 10 examples. So that's 5 lekythoi, 5 stelae, 4 lekythoi, and interestingly, 1 votive relief, which is not a grave monument. And this type depicts multi-figured scenes of a seated woman, disheveled, with her body sinking as attendants attempt to hold her up. The variations of each type show the quite porous practice of stelae production and the unique opportunity of some families to further personalize monuments beyond a simple epitaph. So here we have the first type. So the first type is characterized, as we can see, by a seated woman. In front of her stands an attendant who holds an infant, which is usually swaddled. On the left-hand side, we can see a marble lekythos of Archippe, currently in the Munich Glyptothek, and it's a usual example of the iconography used for this group. The type is an adaptation of a previous depiction of the deceased women, similar to the example that I showed of the Hergeso stele. The seated nature of the woman denotes that the scene is taking place indoors in the traditional sphere of the woman, which is the household. This scene is also depicted on the right-hand side, and this is an example from the town of Sikiko, north of Athens. It shows a really touching scene between a mother and a newborn infant, which is held by an attendant. The infant's left hand was originally stretched out towards the mother, as if attempting to get her attention. Because of the drapery only covering the lower half of the body, the infant is most probably a boy. The infant's gender is significant in this case because of the societal expectation that male children are worth more to the household than female ones. This stele and its eponymous type bring the private setting of the house and the intimate event of childbirth to the public display of the cemetery. Now, the inscription very fortunately survives for this stele, and it states, "Here lies Filonoi, a chaste, sound-minded daughter possessing every virtue." The epitaph honors Filonoi in the usual language appropriate for addressing women, taking note of her multitude of virtues and her chastity. Interestingly, she is referred to as a daughter, but without a patronymic, and most importantly, there is absolutely no mention of the infant or her status as a mother. Now, the presence of the infant in the iconography makes it obvious that Filonoi was being honored as a daughter who did her duty to become a mother. However, that aspect was missed out on in the epitaph. Perhaps the iconography itself was enough to signal to the viewer her role as a mother, or more so the circumstances of her death, Or perhaps this stele was commissioned by her parents, who wanted to highlight her role as a daughter more so than her role as a mother. The tragic degree of separation between her and the infant in front of her suggests that she is in the world of the dead, whilst the infant might have actually survived. Now, an alternative iconographical choice is made on this stele, which is currently in the Louvre, and it depicts a standing woman on the left with an attendant in front of her. Both mother and attendant are holding swaddled infants, and from what I've been able to find, this is the only extant stele in Greek antiquity which depicts twins. Considering the high risk of delivering twins in antiquity, it's no surprise that this pregnancy would have been unsuccessful. But the fact that each woman is holding one infant makes us ask the question if at least one of them survived. Now we move on to type B, or the Arcassis type. It shows the mother seated and holding the infant in her lap. The iconographical language here suggests that both mother and infant are deceased, unlike in the previous type. The physical connection between mother and infant acts as a marker of death. So exemplary of the usual type of this group is a stele from Lyme Park in the UK, and it has a Greek inscription which bears the name of the deceased, that is Arcassis, and you can see that on the left side of your screen. But variants can be found which depict an infant as well as an older child, and one example can be seen on the right hand of your screen, and that is from the Baltimore Walters Art Gallery. It depicts the deceased as she looks down at the swaddled infant in her lap, while in front of her stands what seems to be an older male child holding out a dove. These variations change the meaning of the stele, as its focus now shifts to a more general notion of motherhood instead of a failure to fulfill one's maternal role. The presence of the older child exemplifies that the deceased has already acted as a mother to one child, but has passed during her second childbirth, and presumably the infant hasn't survived either. Now, the main outlier of this group, however, is a stele of Amphoretti. At first glance, the stele looks just like the others. However, the inscription challenges the visual expectations of the type. It states, "It is my daughter's child that I hold here with love, the one whom I held on my lap, while in life we looked on the light of the sun, and now I still hold, dead as I am dead." The name Amphoretti is carved on the base of the pediment, right below the seated women, which is where the stele gets its name from. The inscription denotes Amphoretti as the grandmother with her male grandchild seated in her lap, and we can clearly state that this is a male child, and that's denoted by the use of the philon, which is the masculine accusative within the epitaph. This stele raises the question of how many of the stelae that we have could have potentially depicted grandmothers or aunts that we simply do not know of. Within the stele, Amphoretti is being depicted in her virtues as a surrogate mother to her grandchild. Moreover, by having had her own child, which then has her own child, Amphoretti fulfilled her civic duty of motherhood not once, but twice. We might ask the question here if the daughter had been depicted with an infant in her own stele, and if this is a unique situation in which both grandmother and grandchild die in a short period of time, and therefore they are depicted together. But unfortunately, we don't have enough evidence to connect Amphoretti to any other stele. Furthermore, what's really important is that the stele brings about an interesting question about societal opinions, and specifically Athenian opinions on surrogate motherhood or on surrogacy in general. Now, this last group that we're going to get onto is type C, and it's characteristic in its multi-figured scenes depicting the event of childbirth. The deceased is still seated, but she is slumping in her chair as the attendants attempt to help her up. The deceased's clothes are distressed, her hemation usually falling below the shoulders, and her hair is unbound, and oftentimes we can also see male figures present. Interestingly enough, this stele, specifically the Theophantus type, shows a male figure which shows evidence of recarving in antiquity, and that's the figure which we can see holding the hand of the deceased right in front of her. Now, Maria Catoni argues that the recutting of what used to be the midwife figure into a bearded man is due to a tendency in later periods to make the iconography less intimate and more digestible. However, what I argue is that it's more likely that the wife died first in childbirth and was depicted as such, with her husband dying later and wishing to be depicted in the same relief as his wife, therefore creating the need for the original midwife figure to be recarved into a figure of him. And instead of this being a tendency to make iconography less intimate, I instead argue that it's actually making the iconography much more emotional. Now, the iconographical language used in these examples could possibly come from vase depictions of the death of Semele, who herself died whilst giving birth to Dionysus. She's depicted in the same seating, slumped position, held up by attendants and disrobed. There are such examples that we can see, like this Apulian red figure volute crater from around 330 BCE and the silver skyphos from Pompeii. What we can see from these examples is that there is a clear continuation of iconographical language through different periods and through different mediums, showing that stelae don't develop in a vacuum, but they are instead influenced by related visual arts. However, it's interesting to note that the examples that we have come from a later period and come from Italy instead of actually coming from Greece. Now, I mentioned earlier that in type C, we have a votive relief instead of a grave stelae, and we will talk about this now. It's a similar composition to the other stelae, so specifically the Theophante stelae, and we have a seated mother, heavily slumped, held by an attendant, and the attendant is also holding what we can see is a swaddled infant. In front of them stands a much larger female figure, and this is most probably the goddess Hygeia. Now, this is a relief. It is not a stele, it is a dedication. Because of its unknown provenance, what we can surmise is that it comes from a sanctuary in Athens. However, the subjects presented point to a possible placement within the sanctuary of Asclepios under the Acropolis. Now, it's unclear whether the relief was dedicated for a successful or an unsuccessful childbirth because of the fact that we do not have any inscription that survives with it. But what it does show is that the family of the woman depicted believed it to be appropriate enough to devote in an honorific instead of a funerary context. Now, the Theophante type, or type C, is the most distinctive out of all three types because of quite a daring portrayal of a very intimate act and its depiction of real women as disheveled and unkempt, which is unacceptable in art prior to this time. The type provides us with what we can say is the closest example of a depiction of childbirth in Athenian art, and it does that by employing detailed iconographical language which canonizes parturition within the corpus of classical Athenian grave stelae. Now, what we've seen from these monuments is quite a public display of an intimate moment in a woman's life. We're going to use a few other sources here, and I'm going to focus a bit on Pericles' funeral oration. It notes that it was best for an Athenian woman not to be talked about, so neither for good nor for bad, and especially not by any other man in public. Diana Burton notes that women were expected to avoid the public eye at all costs, and their place was specifically and primarily in the oikos, within the household and with the family. But this raises the question of how can this public display of women, which we see on grave monuments, be reconciled with a societal norm of keeping them hidden? The funerary monuments that I've investigated in this research are examples of really well-crafted iconographical language. And this iconographical language can be manipulated to suit personal means. It's appropriate that this language emerges from the evidence following the establishment of the Periclean laws and the newfound influence that women would have had within the polis. Type A and Type B show an idealized Athenian woman. She's seated as to denote her role within the household. She's stoic and reserved, but at the same time, she's fulfilling her most important duty of motherhood. By portraying women like this, these funerary monuments mark not only the status of the deceased as a mother and her departure from life, but they also mark the status of the commissioner as an Athenian citizen with a legitimate heir, even though that heir might not have always survived. So, although women cannot be said to be citizens, here they are depicted in their duties towards the polis and through their levels of societal participation. They're shown in the closest manner possible to citizens by upholding the citizenship of their husbands and their fathers. Therefore, although women are not citizens, they hold a sort of female citizenship that is characterized by societal participation and the enlargement of the polis, and it is separated from male citizenship whilst also aiding it and upholding it. The stele of Cellino provides an important example, mainly because it records the names of every figure within it. So the mother Cellino and the attendant Nico are expected, but the addition of the name of the infant is quite unusual. The identification of the male infant as Minake points to his survival beyond childbirth. His gender again confirms the notion that only male infants were depicted when identifiable, as can also be seen on the stele of Philonoia. The naming of Minake also further supports the argument that when an infant is held by an attendant who is always still living, that the infant most probably survived childbirth and is therefore physically separated from the mother who is now in the world of the dead. Alternatively, the stele of Amphoretti provides epigraphical evidence of what the iconography represents. Both the seated woman and the infant are deceased. The gestures of reaching out by the infants towards the mother also denote this tragic degree of separation. The presence of a male child confirms societal preferences for gender and also elevates the deceased more for having birthed a male surviving heir. The study of this corpus of funerary monuments shows the strong public messages which iconographical language is sending to the people of Athens. The examples question the space allowed for women and mothers within the polis and show how crucial this depiction was that it facilitated individual variances. Within the Kerameikos, the feminized space of childbearing is contrasted greatly within the masculine display of civic duty. Moreover, the emotional impact that these funerary monuments might have had on viewers must also be investigated. Now, Victoria Reuschle frames the question of the relationship between mothers and children through the conceptual framework of ethos and pathos. Through these, she's able to examine visual art as representing the internal qualities of the subject through external forms, such as facial expressions and gestures. Literature, especially tragedy, often emphasizes the power of childbirth and the deep connection between a mother and a child, and texts often allude to the life-giving power of breastfeeding. We can see this when reading texts like the Medea, the Thesmophoria, and especially the Iliad. On the other hand, the examples that we've noted from these stelae often show the deceased as if she is detached from the world of the living, as if she is emotionless. And it's here that we encounter what I call sort of the problem of the male commissioner and the male artist who create these images as socially constructed schema for the quote unquote ideal mother. It's probable that the connection between the mother and the child is downplayed specifically because of this factor, to the point where the mother-child relationship is only shown in physical terms to denote separation between life and death. So if a mother is holding her baby, both the baby and the mother died. If she is not, then she passed away, but the baby might have survived. However, what we can see is that despite the impassivity of the mother, the motion of the infant, the infant's hand specifically towards the mother, depicts the intense emotions of grief connected to the monument. These stelae construct affective networks between women subjects and viewers. Women, as well as men, would have been able to view these stelae, and many of these women would have lost children themselves. That is not to say that a gender stereotype should be strictly imposed and perpetuated in the difference of male and female viewership, but there is a sense that the experience of viewing these monuments is a complexly layered one, where the civic duty of maternal death is implicated with a heavily affective relationship and a heavily affective experience, usually associated in dramatic tragedy. Now, there's no way of knowing how involved Athenian women would have been in the design of their own grave monuments, unlike the copious amounts of evidence that we have of Roman women. But considering the high mortality rates of mothers, it is likely that most Athenian women would personally or distantly know of someone who had passed during childbirth or someone who had lost their child. Different studies pose varying numbers as to mortality rates, but it's generally accepted that 1 in 3 women would have died during childbirth, and only 40% of infants would have survived their first year of life. These numbers also do not account for miscarriages, stillbirths, infections, and diseases. For younger girls, these depictions would have been a reminder of their future and what they had to overcome, the dangers of pregnancy that they would have to face. For older women, the stelae would be reminiscent of their struggles, but also would show the fates of all of their friends or family members who had passed away in childbirth as well. The women of Athens would surely have been affected by the stelae in a more personal way. Now, male citizens might have more focused on the loss to the polis and the repercussions of losing an heir, but again, something to note is that this gender binary can't be strictly imposed because, as with a lot of things in archaeology, we can never truly state how people would have actually felt when looking at these monuments. Now, we started with this quote, we're going to end with it. Diana Burton says that for the ancient Greeks, death was a very public affair. The life of women, on the other hand, was not. We know that women were kept inside and they were not allowed to be seen or heard of. However, through these grave stelae and marble lekythoi, an intimately female event is now shown to the public and inherently creates a strong reaction from the audience. The very private virtues of women are now made public, and in doing so, completely shift the focus of Athenian art to a previously lesser depicted subject. And herein lies the concept of kalos thanatos, or what we call the noble death. By dying in childbirth, women are inherently fulfilling their most important role in society, and therefore deserve the most honorable death. This can, of course, be compared to the theory that Sparta's Lycurgan laws allowed women who had died in childbirth to be honored with a stele in the same way that men who had died in battle were depicted. This reminds us of the famous line in Medea, "I would rather stand in battle 3 times with a shield than give birth once." But although we have no definitive evidence that this was the case in Sparta, it still brings about an interesting comparison of differing views of childbirth across the Greek world. Hopefully, this talk has shown you that grave stelae are an extremely useful corpus of evidence for examining the status of women in ancient Athens and societal rules of life and death. By analyzing this corpus, we're able to move away from the male-centric view of funerary art and reveal a degree of nuance within the evidence that has previously been missed. Women might not be citizens, but they can uphold the citizenship of their husbands. They're expected to stay within the oikos, but they are publicly commemorated and honored. They're depicted as ideal and stoic, almost emotionless, but their crucial role as mothers and their loss to society and the family are betrayed by the yearning of the infant, the mourning of the attendants, and the effect they would have had on the viewers, both male and female. Moving forward, I really do believe that further research has to be done on funerary reliefs outside of Athens and the classical period, especially on the painted Hellenistic grave stelae from Volos and Alexandria, which I've put on the screen here. The scenes depicted in these monuments are quite intimate and very exposing, and their poem-like epitaphs are even more so. I really do think that there's such an intimate aspect of ancient grave monuments, and they really need to be researched furthermore. But for now, I'm going to leave you at that. I hope you've learnt something you didn't know beforehand. And if you have any questions, I'd love to answer whatever I can.